Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring something wild, a massive, totally invisible graveyard. I'm talking about the graveyard of ideas that just didn't make it. Think about it. Our modern world feels so incredibly inevitable, right? We wake up, grab our smartphones, hop in our cars, and navigate a society that feels like it was always destined to look exactly this way. But actually, scratch that. Behind every single successful system, there is this whole hidden archive of failed futures. Political programs that got suddenly dumped, scientific models that were quietly swept under the rug, and technologies that literally vanished before they could even make a dent in our reality. So today, we're going to see how digging up those failures completely and fundamentally shifts how we view human progress. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We're going to cover history remembers its winners, the power of negative knowledge, 7 ways futures fail, resisting the countercanon, the memory of near misses, and finally, a new map of progress. Let's get right into it. All right, part 1, history remembers its winners. We all know the old cliche, right? History is written by the victors. But human archives love to tidy things up. They arrange messy events into this retrospectively calming, logical sequence. And this exposes a massive collective blind spot for us. We look back and we treat surviving systems, realized futures and dominant tech, as if they were just pure destiny. We act like the present we're living in right now was the absolutely only logical destination. But the reality? Every realized future was once surrounded by a huge constellation of other, totally viable possibilities. Take the early 1900s for a second. The internal combustion engine wasn't actually the inevitable winner of the automobile race. Back then, electric vehicles and steam-powered cars were highly competitive alternatives. At the exact moment of decision, all those different paths had entirely different degrees of public support, momentum, and plausibility. It wasn't a done deal. Our standard history of winners hands us a really clean lineage. It's honestly like walking through a museum with a freshly swept floor, just admiring the winning inventions sitting safely under spotless glass. But the archive of failed futures shows us the actual construction debris. It reveals the abandoned roads, the broken scaffolding, and all the weeds that naturally surround every major historical decision. See, when we take the basic fact that a possibility just wasn't realized and swap it with the much more dangerous claim that it literally could not have been realized, well, we end up entirely distorting the past. Which brings us to section 2, the power of negative knowledge. So, what exactly do we gain from sifting through all this discarded construction debris? Well, the crucial thing to remember here is that failure isn't just empty space. It's not just a mistake you toss in the trash and forget about. It's actually a highly readable imprint. A failure takes the exact shape of what a specific era believed, what it was terrified of, or what it literally just couldn't pull off technically at the time. We call this negative knowledge. Now, it doesn't necessarily hand us objective truth on a silver platter, but it tells us exactly where a historical claim hit a brick wall. Think about early alchemy. Its failure didn't instantly invent modern chemistry for us, but it did generate a massive body of negative knowledge about the limits of material transmutation. It clearly defined the exact boundaries where that whole concept just broke down. And when a model breaks down like that, it systematically generates 4 very specific forms of negative knowledge. First off, a boundary is revealed. This tells us exactly where a model stopped working in the real world. Second, a hidden assumption is exposed. This is cool because it takes the invisible background furniture of reality and suddenly turns it into a structure we can actually see. Third, it highlights system interactions. It shows us these complex, tangled feedback loops that we totally overlooked until they cause the whole thing to crash. And finally, number 4, it reveals observer bias. This shows us what people in a certain age were perfectly willing to sacrifice or just ignore. In a weird way, the error itself actually gives our eventual knowledge its exact shape. Moving on to section 3, 7 ways futures fail. To really ground this philosophy, we have to understand that a future doesn't just broadly fail. If we lump every single abandoned idea under one giant umbrella called failure, we completely lose the distinct structural reasons why a specific timeline was aborted. Using failure as a catch-all is basically a compression device that actively hides the truth. Because let's be honest, a scientific hypothesis that gets refuted by hard evidence is a completely different animal than a massive infrastructure project getting dumped just because a government ran out of cash. When we break these down, the differences are incredibly stark. Take an implementation failure, for instance. This means the core idea was perfectly sound, but the translation into the real world just didn't work. Charles Babbage designed a fully functional mechanical computer all the way back in the 1830s, the analytical engine. Absolute genius idea. but Victorian machining simply was not precise enough to actually build the parts. That is a textbook implementation failure. Contrast that with ethical rejection. Here, a project might be totally feasible from an engineering perspective, but society steps in and says, no way, those means are unacceptable. It's feasible, but forbidden. And then you have political defeat. This means a program wasn't necessarily disproved, and it wasn't technically wrong, it just lost its power base. Kind of like Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower losing all its funding to Marconi's competing radio system. The lesson here, power can absolutely protect terrible systems, but for sure it can also prevent worse ones.
Let's hit section 4, resisting the countercanon.
Okay, this is where we run into a major trap with this entire archive. Just because an idea was rejected does not mean it was secretly brilliant. As a culture, we have this powerful machinery that loves to romanticize neglect. You know the trope. An unpublished manuscript or a defunded project suddenly gets painted as this forbidden brilliance by later generations. But listen, preservation does not confer plausibility. Institutional hostility is evidence of power, sure, but is not automatically evidence of some hidden truth. Some ideas were blocked because they were genuinely dangerous, utterly incoherent, or would have been an absolute nightmare for the people forced to live under them. We have to really resist this urge to romanticize historical losers just because they lost. To avoid falling into that trap, an archive really has to preserve a failed idea through a very specific, structured life cycle. We start phase 1 by documenting the original raw claim, exactly as it was made. Next, we record the contemporary dissent, meaning what were the arguments of the people who were actively fighting it at the time. Then we layer in later historical assessments, before finally settling on its current archival status. This step-by-step approach is absolutely crucial. It ensures we document the historical friction without rewriting history to make the failure look like a misunderstood genius. We preserve the disagreement without pretending the winning and losing ideas were somehow equally valid.
Section 5, the memory of near misses.
Now we are turning to what's probably the most elusive type of failed future, the catastrophe that never actually arrived. I want you to ask yourself a question. Does the absence of damage mean the absence of danger? Seriously, think about it. Because organizations are incredibly prone to learning the exact wrong lesson when they survive a close call. Consider NASA and the Space Shuttle Challenger. For years leading up to it, the O-rings experienced partial damage during cold launches, but it didn't cause a total disaster. When a dangerous setup produces no immediate damage, institutions have this terrible habit of looking at the absence of harm and confidently assuming, hey, the system is perfectly safe. They interpret mere survival as proof of great design, so they just keep operating closer and closer to the edge until the disaster finally, inevitably, strikes. So whenever a disaster is avoided, you always have to ask, was the system robust, meaning active built-in safeguards actually caught the failure? Or was it just fortunate, meaning the super-specific, lucky combination of events for a catastrophe just hadn't happened yet? This feeds right into something called the prevention paradox. The Y2K bug is a brilliant historical example of this. Back in the late 90s, there were massive warnings about a potential global computing collapse. Billions of dollars were spent, intense action was taken worldwide, and the disaster was totally averted. But what was the result? The programmers who successfully fixed it were often mocked afterward. People rolled their eyes and said the whole warning was wildly exaggerated. They completely forgot that the warning and the massive frantic effort that followed was literally the exact thing that altered the causal chain and erased the catastrophe in the first place. And finally, Section 6, a new map of progress. Let's pull all these threads together. Instead of picturing progress as this triumphant, straight staircase leading inevitably upward to where we are today, it's more like progress is carved out of the void. It is a selective movement through a completely branching, broken, and chaotic space of possibilities. The achievements of our current world only truly make sense when we take a step back and place them right alongside the specific alternatives they defeated, outlasted, or replaced. Our reality is shaped just as much by what it flat-out rejected as by what it embraced. Just think about our realized reality. It's only one tiny slice of the historical pie. The rest of the shape of our modern world is entirely held together by the sacrifices, the ethical limits, the prevented harms, and that negative knowledge of what didn't happen. Every single durable theory we rely on carries the heavy and visible traces of the broken models that came before it. And every functioning institution is literally built right on top of the blueprints of the ones that collapsed. So what's the big takeaway for us today, living our lives inside these modern systems? It's this. A culture that only ever remembers what worked will continuously, dangerously, misrecognize the cost of its current success. If we just blindly inherit polished theories without bothering to understand their discarded assumptions, and if we just blindly accept functioning systems without studying their near failures, we end up knowing the answer while completely forgetting the errors that made the question make sense in the first place. Progress becomes a whole lot more responsible when it stops mistaking mere survival for innocence. I want to leave you with this final, provocative challenge to how you view the so-called inevitability of our modern world. If we don't remember the exact shape of our historical boundaries, we might just march right past them all over again, mistakenly thinking an old, dangerous ruin is a brand new frontier. Thank you so much for joining this explainer. I really hope this completely changed how you look at the past, our present, and all those fascinating paths we never took.